Caseus. Jedi Redeemed. Chapter 6. Caseus and Pip waited by the Arabella, and soon Bendel and the others arrived.
What'd you find out?
The Western Mountains. There's a series of abandoned foundries. That's where we'll check next.
And you're sure about this?
It's our best option. Unless you want to waste more time here digging for clues.
All right, then. Let's get to it.
The crew climbed on board as Caseus clenched the fingers of his cybernetic hand together. He was itching to find Dotami and the others responsible. It was becoming unbearable. As the ship took off and flew northwest towards the mountains, Caseus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why, but it felt familiar. He ignored it, chalking it up to the fact that he knew what he was going to do to Dotami went against everything the Jedi stood for. He told himself to ignore it. And he did. Any semblance of reason or mercy that crawled into his mind, he shut it down. It wasn't the first time he'd gone down this path. Vader, Zolan and his gang on Dantooine, Rax. Each time he followed through on his pursuit for vengeance, he ended up regretting it later, in one way or another. Not this time. This time there would be no one left to come back for him. He'd make sure of it. Traveling through hyperspace, Guidome tried to calm himself. But it was useless. Caseus was about to make a terrible mistake by going after Dotami and his men. He had to stop him, help him see reason. But if he was going to do that, he had to get there fast, before any blood could be spilled. On his waist, he carried his lightsaber, constructed after his original was taken from him on Bakura. Slowly, he caressed the hilt and sighed. He didn't want to have to use it. On Dandaren, Caseus sat silently as the Arabella moved through the approaching storm clouds and within range of the western mountains.
Anything, Kresh?
Kresh snorted and looked at the scanners before turning to Bendel and grunting.
Kresh says the scanners are detecting man-made structures in the mountains. Might be the foundries we're looking for.
Any life forms?
Can't tell. There's a storm coming through. It's messing with our tech.
As they approached the mountains, Caseus looked out the viewport and saw a few tall smokestacks and rusted metal structures. Get us closer.
Bad idea. If they are there, we might be spotted. And we haven't had a chance to fix up the cloaking device after a nasty mishap on Malastare.
Just do it. Bendel shrugged and brought the ship closer. As he did, Caseus closed his eyes and reached out with his hand, trying to sense any sign of life inside the abandoned buildings. There's someone there.
You sure?
Positive. Bring us down. Bendel and Kresh lowered the ship towards a large plateau along the side of the mountain and sat down. Everyone gather your things. If you think you're prepared enough, you aren't. Anything that could be useful, bring it. Bendel nodded as he and Daros went through their gear, grabbing whatever may come in handy in a fight. Tosa and Kresh gave their guns one final inspection, as Pip calibrated the settings on his Shockmaster. Let's move. Stepping off the ramp and onto the plateau, Caseus took a deep breath. The smell of old industry from the polluted factory runoff filling his nose. The cliff face had a relatively gentle incline. With a bit of effort, they made their way up as the first few drops of warm summer rain fell on their heads. Soon, they were staring straight at the large abandoned foundries ahead of them. Or seemingly abandoned, Caseus thought. Pip looked up at the tall structures.
Yeah, this seems like the kind of place for a couple of scumbags to hide.
They made their way forward to a large metal door, recently used from the looks of a set of tracks in the dirt. Stooping down, Tosa examined the tracks and scooped up a handful of dirt to his nose.
Trandoshan. Zarosh was here not long ago. Your information was useful after all, Caseus.
Caseus stepped towards the door, and using the force, caused the heavy metal to lift from the ground and lock into place above them. It was dark inside, save for a few lamps that lit the interior. Someone was occupying this place. Pip stayed close to Caseus, his weapon in his hand. This way. Tosa, do you see anything with your thermal vision? Tosa snarled and sniffed through the air as his sight adjusted to the dim lighting. He could see faint trails leading in different directions and focused on the freshest one.
This way.
Following Tosa, they were led through corridors formerly occupied by foremen and non-labor workers. Caseus and the others kept their weapons ready and their eyes and ears alert, hearing nothing at first aside from the occasional clanging of old pipes and creaking metal of the structure. Passing through a doorway, they stepped across a long metal catwalk, over tall empty vats once containing molten metal and raw materials. Each step echoed throughout the man-made caverns of industrial design. As they reached the end of the catwalk, they heard something. Faint voices, not so far away. Slowly, they inched forward as the voices became clearer. I'm telling you, I saw a ship land not far from here. Someone is coming.
You are certain of this, boy?
Yes, I'm certain. Who else knows that we're out here?
Well, I certainly didn't tell anyone. Most likely those Valkorians. They stick out like a sore thumb wherever we go. Those drunkards might have led someone right to us. Zarosh, go take a look around. Fine. I'm gonna have a chat with those Valkorians later.
Caseus signaled his crew to hide as they all ducked behind cover in dark corners of the area. They heard a door open and saw a crack of light shine down a long hallway as the imposing shadow of a Trandoshan came into view. Caseus knew all too well the keen senses of even aged Trandoshans like Tosa and Zarosh. If they were caught, it could mean trouble. From around the corner, Zarosh stepped into view as Caseus glared at him from behind a tall metal crate. Just as Zarosh walked towards the catwalk, he stopped and sniffed the air. He smelled them. Thinking quickly, Daros grabbed his toolkit from his belt and chucked it out of the doorway past the catwalk to the ground below. The loud clanging grabbed his attention more than the scent, as he quickly turned like a startled bird and rushed out onto the catwalk and down a ladder. Caseus stepped out from behind cover and whispered, "This way." Slowly, the group made their way towards the open doorway. They were now right in front of it. Caseus knew that Dotame and Haji were right on the other side. This was it. Nodding to his crew, they quickly burst through the doorway and saw no one. Their surprise soon turned to shock as from either side of the door, the two Valkorians pounced and grabbed Kresh and Daros, throwing them into the wall. Tosa and Pip tried to fight, but were both tackled from behind by Zarosh, who had clearly caught wind of their little evasion tactic. Caseus reached for his lightsaber and Bendel for his blaster, when they heard blasters charge up from behind them. Turning around, Caseus saw Dotame emerge from behind a blind corner, along with Haji, both aiming their weapons at the Jedi and his crew, who were now incapacitated and struggling.
Well, look who it is. Consider me impressed, Urshan. Kessel is supposed to be a death sentence. But you haven't lost your drive at all, have you?
Caseus seethed and glared at Dotame.
You must think me dense if you thought I didn't see this coming. We noticed your ship as soon as it landed. Of course, I didn't expect to see you again, of all people.
Dotame stepped just a few feet from Caseus.
You were foolish to come here, Jedi. Even with this gaggle of hoodlums. You fell right into my clutches once again.
Dotame aimed his blaster at Caseus, who stayed motionless.
Nothing to say? Aren't you going to beg for mercy like last time?
Caseus closed his eyes.
Aw. This didn't pan out like you thought it would, did it, Caseus? Well, I'll put an end to this humiliation right now. When you see your apprentice, tell her Dotame Fortuan sends his warmest regards.
Just as Dotame's finger touched the trigger, Caseus' eyes shot open as he sent out a mighty repulse that knocked everyone in the room off their feet, enemies and allies. As bodies collided with the walls and floors, Caseus ran at Dotame and drew his lightsaber. Just before he could strike him down, Zarosh leapt from his staggered state and clung to Caseus and clawed at his shoulders. Tosa leapt up next and dragged Zarosh off of his comrade and tackled him through a nearby window out into the assembly line area of the foundries, their weapons falling behind them. Dotami tried to grab his blaster, but Caseus called it to his hand with the force and crushed it in his cybernetic grip. The Valkorians rushed at Caseus, but were grabbed by Kresh and Daros, who struggled to hold them off. Haji stood in a daze and fired at Caseus, hitting him in the shoulder. He cried out and looked at Haji, who fired again, only for his shot to be deflected at the wall. Bendel grabbed his weapon and fired, nearly missing Haji, who ducked behind cover. Soon, the room was in chaos. Dotami, seeing the danger, reached into his pocket and pulled out a smoke bomb, throwing it at the floor, covering the whole room in a cloud of smoke before running out of the back door of the office and into the corridors of the foundry. Caseus coughed and pushed his way through, pursuing Dotami, as Daros and Kresh fought against the Valkorians and Bendel against Haji. Daros had grown stronger, but the Valkorians rivaled even Kresh in size, and threw the young man to the wall. Before they could grab him, Kresh swung the barrel of his buster cannon straight into the skull of the first and knocked him to the ground, where Pip jumped on top of him, wailing on him with his shockmaster. The other Valkorian gnashed his teeth at Daros, who kicked him in the face and right into the arms of Kresh, who in one swift motion threw him onto the floor, knocking the wind from his lungs. All the while, Haji ran from Bendel down a narrow corridor and up a flight of stairs, firing back at the young rebel, who faltered back and ducked for cover. Haji bolted up the stairs with Bendel in hot pursuit. Running through a door, Haji hid just on the other side of the entrance. Bendel cautiously moved forward, keeping his blaster in front of him. Just as he stepped into the room, Haji grabbed Bendel's blaster arm and yanked down, aiming his weapon at Bendel's face. Bendel, acting completely on instinct, threw his free hand in front of him, grabbing Haji's weapon hand, as the two fired shots that missed their targets and grappled with each other. Both were soon disarmed by the other and relied solely on their fists and feet, punching and kicking and trading stiff blows to each other before Haji ducked to avoid a strike and grabbed Bendel in a chokehold.
I know you. You're Bendel Tyron. You're Rex's kid, right? You're as much of a coward as he was.
Haji yelled and squeezed as Bendel threw himself backwards at the wall, smashing against Haji and making him lose his grip. Bendel landed blow after blow to his face, but Haji soon drew a knife from his belt and slashed Bendel across his stomach. Bendel reeled back as Haji rushed forward, blade in hand. Bendel dodged and rolled to avoid the strikes, and grabbed Haji's wrist as he thrusted downward, the knife inching slowly closer towards his face. Thinking quickly, Bendel twisted Haji's wrist, forcing him to drop the knife, which clattered on the ground. The fight was even again, as the sons of Harbo and Rax traded blows once more. Back with Kresh, he and Daros surrounded the remaining Valkorian, who stood in a defensive pose.
You enslaved me as a child. I feared you. Not anymore.
The Valkorian jumped in the air, grabbing a pipe from the ceiling and ripped it off, spraying a stream of hot steam into the face of Kresh, who reeled back as the Valkorian lunged at Daros and sank his claws into the young man's arms. Daros screamed in pain, but headbutted the Valkorian with all his strength, freeing himself.
Daros, look out!
Daros turned and saw the other Valkorian awake from his stupor, charging at him. Daros ducked and weaved as Kresh regained his strength and roared loudly. The Valkorians covered their sensitive ears and cringed at the noise, giving Daros just enough time to grab his blaster and shoot one of them in the chest, killing him. Kresh grabbed hold of the other and slammed him full force through the wall and onto the cold metal ground before stomping on his head, ending his life. Daros breathed heavily and looked around.
Where's Bendel?
This has been a long time coming, Zarosh. You're a disgrace to your species, Tosa. Siding with the enemy. Turning on your own kind. I simply found a better cause than killing for whatever rat tosses me a couple of credits. You're weak as what you are. Soft. Maybe I've just learned to choose my own path. You're a hunter, Tosa. A predator by birth. But you've chosen to spit in the face of the scorekeeper. After I'm through with you, that boy is next.
Tosa snarled and bared his teeth.
You lay a single claw on him, and I'll tear out your throat.
Zarosh screeched and lunged at Tosa as the two Trandoshans clawed into each other, viciously slashing and gnawing at the other. Zarosh was larger and more physically imposing than Tosa, but Tosa had the advantage of speed and agility. As Zarosh sank his jaws into Tosa's arm, Tosa jabbed one of his clawed fingers into Zaro's eye, forcing his old rival to scream and let go. Tosa held his bleeding arm as Zaro slashed wildly with his claws. Tosa ducked and dodged and leapt back before pouncing, tackling Zaros to the floor as they scuffled and ravaged each other like starved beasts, fighting over the last scrap of meat. Bendel and Haji were both tiring as they stared at each other, both bleeding and bruised. Haji swung his fist at Bendel, who ducked and caught Haji's arm, snapping it over his knee and breaking it. Haji cried in agony as Bendel leapt on top of him and punched him in the throat again and again until Haji's breathing became labored and wheezy. Looking to his left, Bendel grabbed his blaster and aimed it directly into the face of Haji, who lay still, completely exhausted.
Do it. Just kill me.
Bendel kept his blaster aimed carefully between the eyes of his enemy, his finger on the trigger. But he didn't fire. He wanted answers.
Why? Why did you kill her? Why?
Haji coughed and spat blood onto the floor.
She and the Jedi killed my dad. What would you do?
Bendel was furious, but he still refused to fire.
That girl you killed. I loved her.
Haji closed his eyes and sighed.
Then do it. Kill me. Let me be with my dad.
Bendel's hand shook as he aimed his blaster and fired a stun blast directly into Haji's chest, knocking him out cold. He sat on his knees for a moment before dragging Haji down the steps back toward his friends. Dotami ran as fast as he could. He had made it out of the foundries and was running deep into the mountain wilderness as the rain poured around him, his sluggish physique beginning to take its toll. Looking around, he saw no sign of pursuit. Stopping, he coughed and gasped, desperately trying to catch his breath. As he did, he heard the sounds of rocks clattering as they tumbled off the cliff sides. He looked around and saw no one. Nothing. Until from the fog emerged Caseus, a look of rage upon his face as his saber ignited. Slowly, he walked closer to Dotami. He didn't need to chase him. He didn't want to. He wanted to savor this. Dotami pathetically turned and tried to run again as Cassius methodically paced towards him. Dotami flailed his arms as he ran, only to hit a dead end as he nearly ran over a steep ledge to the rocks below. Now more frightened than ever, Dotami turned to Cassius and drew a small backup blaster from inside his garments and fired several shots, one after another. Every one was child's play to the weary Jedi, who swatted every single blast away. Dotami began to whimper as he fired one more shot at Cassius, who redirected this final blast into Dotami's hand, causing him to drop his weapon over the cliff and hold his hand in pain. Cassius now stood mere feet from Dotami, who fell to his knees and looked up in fear, regretting ever having encountered him on Chandrila.
Dotami Fortuan. I've dreamt of this moment for a long time.
Please don't kill me. I beg of you, Jedi.
Oh. I'm going to kill you. Do you know what you took from me that day? You didn't just kill my student. You took my daughter from me. The one thing still tethering me to hope. Then you sent me to suffer in slavery. All the while you and your stooges hide out here in hut space, laughing, thinking you won.
As Dotami bowed in terror, not daring to look at Cassius, the Jedi noticed something around Dotami's neck. Liara's necklace. The one he had given to her on her birthday. Cassius called out with the force and hoisted Dotami by his throat into the air, and ripped the necklace from around his wrinkled neck.
And that just sealed your fate, Dotami.
Cassius dropped Dotami in a heap in front of his feet and raised his saber in the air. Cassius, stop! Cassius halted and turned around and saw Gaidom running over. Cassius, put your saber away, now!
Stay out of this!
Caseus, I know why you want him dead. I know what he took from you. But what will this change? Killing him won't bring Liara back.
I don't care. He dies today. By my hand.
Caseus, don't make me do this.
Gaidom withdrew his lightsaber, shining with a vibrant orange blade. Caseus looked at Gaidom and back to Dotami. He shut his eyes before returning his gaze to his friend.
Then do what you have to do.
Caseus turned swiftly to Dotami and swung his saber downward, only for his hand to freeze in midair. Turning, he saw Gaidom reaching out, holding onto his arm through the force. He glared at Gaidom.
I'm taking you back to Yavin. You need help.
Caseus pushed back with the force as Gaidom flew through the air and landed gracefully on his feet.
Caseus, the dark side is corrupting you. Don't let it take you.
Caseus gripped his saber tightly.
You don't get to lecture me! Your rebellion has brought me nothing. Nothing but loss and pain. I'm telling you this one last time. Back down!
Gaidom stared at Caseus.
I'm sorry, Caseus.
Gaidom ran at his friend as the two clashed sabers in the pouring rain. Tosa and Zarosh fought fiercely, each missing chunks of skin and flesh, but only one would live to regenerate from this battle. Zarosh grabbed Tosa by the back of his head, slamming his face down into a rough metal edge of the assembly line, knocking out several of his teeth and bruising and breaking bones in his face. In a last-ditch attempt to save himself, Tosa slammed the back of his head directly into the snout of Zarosh, stunning him briefly. In that moment, Tosa climbed onto Zarosh from behind, sinking his claws into whatever flesh he could grasp before clasping his jaws onto the neck of his foe and keeping his grasp as tight as possible. Zarosh thrashed and squirmed, slamming himself to the ground and into walls, breaking bones in Tosa's arms and legs, but Tosa kept his jaws locked tight. Soon, Zarosh began to fade, collapsing to his knees before falling over. The last thing he saw was Tosa sinking his jaws directly into his windpipe, crushing his throat. Vendel and the others showed up just in time to see a bloodied and battered Tosa screech at the top of his lungs in a mighty victory cry.
Tosa! Did you?
Tosa stood and held onto his wounded appendages.
The scorekeeper is pleased.
Where's Caseus?
In the mountain pass, Caseus clashed blades with Gaidom. Neither wanted to fight, but they were obstacles in each other's paths. Gaidom deflected a strike to his arm and kicked Caseus in the face, stunning him briefly.
Stop this, Caseus! Now!
Caseus scowled and pressed his attack against Gaidom. All the while, Dotami started to slink away, hoping not to be noticed. Caseus saw this attempt, however, and punched Gaidom in the face before running and leaping in the air towards Dotami. Gaidom grabbed Caseus out of the air and threw him to the ground before jumping over and striking at his arm, but Caseus deflected the attack and kicked Gaidom's chest before leaping back to his feet and catching another flurry of attacks. As out of practice as Caseus was, his determination drove him forward. His experience and training that had been instilled in him since childhood was still beyond what Gaidom had fought before. Gaidom, however, would not be deterred. His own determination rivaled that of his friend, and one way or another, he would put an end to Caseus' vengeful rage. Dotami escaped the fight and ran as fast as he could back through the mountain pass and towards the foundries, until he reached the hangar where his shuttle was stationed. Running on board, he stepped into the cockpit, laughing to himself. Caseus wouldn't have the last laugh. He'd go straight to the Empire and tell them everything. Just as his ship flew into the air above the mountains, Dotami felt a sharp zap on his leg as he fell down stunned.
I don't think so, buddy.
Pip hopped into the pilot's seat and brought the ship back down to the mountain pass, seeing Bendel, Kresh, and the others carrying Haji. Setting the ship down, Pip stepped off the ramp.
Caught old Three Eyes trying to escape.
Bendel smirked and stepped on board, hauling Dotami's unconscious body over to the others.
Now, where's Caseus?
That might be a clue.
Pip pointed over to the mountain clearing, where bright flashes of green and orange illuminated the fog.
What the hell? Kresh, grab Fortuan.
Kresh sighed, now hauling both Haji and Dotami on his shoulders as they rushed over to the clearing. Caseus and Gaidom's blades locked in a bind as they glared at each other.
You should have stayed on Yavin.
Gaidom grimaced and stared into Caseus' eyes.
Liara would be ashamed of you.
Caseus roared in anger as he pressed as hard as he could against Gaidom's saber, forcing the orange blade into Gaidom's left eye. Gaidom cried in pain and dropped to his knees as Caseus stood over him, snarling like an enraged beast.
Caseus!
Caseus looked over and saw Bendel and the others staring at him in fear. Even Pip was holding out his wrench as though he may have to defend himself. Caseus then looked down at Gaidom, holding his blinded eye in pain. Caseus looked down at his reflection in a puddle of rainwater and dropped his saber. He didn't see himself. What he saw, he didn't recognize. A monster inside of his own skin. All at once, Caseus' rage left him, replaced instead by shame.
Gaidom.
Gaidom stood holding his eye, staring at Caseus in disgust.
Gaidom.
Before he could say another word, Caseus was knocked unconscious by a stun blast from Bendel. Gaidom looked over to Bendel, who stared back, unsure of what to do.
Get the Arabella. And some restraints.